Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Dead just 1 week into her Australian honeymoon, Tina Watson's body lay 100 feet below the ocean surface at the foot of the Great Barrier Reef. Across the globe, 3 days into a secret Aruban getaway with an older gentleman she met online, Robyn Gardner vanished from the same Aruban town as Natalee Holloway, who had just 5 years earlier. Why did Robyn Gardner's travel companion purchase a $1.5 million insurance policy and make himself the beneficiary? Did Tina Watson's husband really insist she increase her life insurance coverage to $1 million before the wedding? When both suspect stories are deemed suspicious, what does the evidence ultimately reveal? Motive and opportunity gave the media full opportunity to cast these suspects as murderers. But what actually happened? And what is it about this pair of bizarre cases that remains brutally chilling to this day? The book that we're featuring this evening is Vanished Beauty, Fatal Sunset, with my special guest, journalist and author, Mark Yoshimoto Nemkoff. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Mark Yoshimoto Nemkoff.
Dan, thank you so much for having me on. It's my pleasure. I love your show, by the way.
Oh, well, thank you very much, and you fit right in there with all the other denizens of the program here. I think we're going to have a great program here because it's a wild, wild story. A question that I often ask, without giving too much away at all, how is it that you came to write this story? What was it about these two stories, about these two cases, that compelled you or drove you to decide to write this book, Vanished Beauty, Fatal Sunset?
Well, last year I had written a book called Fatal Sunset, Deadly Vacations, which was really a compilation of a number of different stories of people who, met their demise during their vacation. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, it's kind of a bizarre topic, but I was on the island of Maui, and this guy who just happened to be there at the same time, another tourist, 9 miles up the road, he fell into a natural. It's a thing. It's called the Natalee blowhole, which sounds really dirty, but it's really just like a geyser that comes up underneath this lava shelf. And this guy fell in and he vanished. And this happened while I was on the island, and I was terrified by the idea that he fell into this thing and vanished, and they never found him. And I started to write this book, and I started to write about these stories, and I wrote about Natalee Holloway. And I was just horrified at the Natalee Holloway story, how this was a case that probably could have been solved, and it wasn't. And as I was working on a sequel this year for Fatal Sunset, Deadly Vacation, this one that became Vanished Beauty, I looked back at the Natalee Holloway case, and I noticed there was this Robyn Gardner case that was incredibly similar to the Natalee Holloway case. Now, Natalee Holloway was 18. She had just graduated high school. Robyn Gardner was 36, but they were approximately the same height, the same build, the same look, blonde hair, blue eyes. And I thought it was very bizarre that they had both disappeared under very mysterious circumstances from the same exact Aruban resort. So I started to look into this case, and I realized there were a lot of aspects to not just how she disappeared, the strangeness of just another blonde American woman vanishing from an Aruban beach. But there were these elements to her story about the people who were involved, just her traveling companion. And she had met this guy. It was an older man she met online. And she took this trip with him that she didn't tell anybody about. She didn't tell her family about. She didn't tell her boyfriend about. And she vanishes. And as I dug into this story more and more, and I looked into this kind of shady character that she went to Aruba with, I first felt like, wow, this is again another obviously open and shut case. Why couldn't they bring this case to trial? Why couldn't they solve this case? And as I dug more into the evidence and really the public perception of what was going on, because again, with the shadow of Natalee Holloway's disappearance, how that was a worldwide news sensation, there was this taint on this Robyn Gardner disappearance, because everything that happened in the Robyn Gardner case was being held up to the incompetence of the Natalee Holloway investigation. So I felt that there was really more to this story than just a chapter in another book that was a compilation of several different deadly vacation stories. And as I looked into it more and more and deeper, and the characters started to get weirder, and this guy that she went with, who seemed like such an obvious villain, there were elements to this that pulled me in, because every time I looked up something about Robyn Gardner or her traveling companion, this guy Gary Giordano, or her boyfriend, I started to find things in this story that just made my jaw drop. This thing had so many twists and turns. And I wondered to myself, how do you write this thing? How do you publicly indict someone who was never really brought to trial for this crime? Because they had arrested Gary Giordano, but they released him 4 months later because they couldn't build a case against him. And I was like, I can build a case against this guy. Let me do it.
Well, Mark, let's go back like you were able to do that, and you do that in the book very, very effectively. Let's go back a little bit here before we talk about Gary Giordano, because Richard Forster is the boyfriend of Robyn Gardner, and that's not her maiden name. So let's go back just a little bit with Robyn, and just tell who Robyn is in terms of her. We'll say her history in terms of being married. Let's go back with a little bit into Robyn's life before we introduce Richard Forster, and well before we get into Gary Giordano, so we can paint the picture and introduce these characters.
Okay, well, Robyn Gardner was kind of a hometown girl, grew up outside of Washington, D.C., and she had been married before. She married a guy who was a real estate he was a senior executive at one of these companies that goes and builds big housing developments.
Right.
And, of course, the recession hit and crushed the construction industry, and this guy loses his job and their marriage falls apart. And
but they were living a pretty lavish lifestyle, Mercedes-Benz in the driveway, and so let's not leave that out. She did get a taste for the high life and the good life, right?
That's right. She was definitely living a very upper middle class, almost like a dream life for a young lady who wants these types of things. And so here she was, and she was divorced from her husband and facing a very, very contentious alimony battle with her husband, who was unemployed, who couldn't find a job afterwards, tried to start his own business building houses, and that didn't take off. And then she was working as a dental assistant, and also trying at the same time. She was a very attractive woman, 36. She was trying to kickstart a modeling career. Now 36 is not the age at which one starts a modeling career.
No.
It's about 22 years late for starting a modeling career.
Right.
And so here she was, and there was this almost you'd almost feel like there was a sense of desperation in her life, because she was with this guy Richard Forster, who she also met online, and they were together, but things weren't exactly rosy between them. So here she was, and there are aspects of Robyn's life that make her seem like she could be anyone. But then there were secrets that she kept that really kind of painted a much different picture about her as the story developed.
Right.
So she was definitely someone who liked to how should I say it? She liked to have fun, and she liked to keep secrets, which is one of the reasons why when she had this friend, Gary Giordano, who she met online as well through a swinger website, that she didn't tell her boyfriend about it. All her boyfriend knew about this guy, Gary Giordano, was he was a friend, just a platonic friend. That's all she told him. But it wasn't the truth, not at all.
Mm. Now, they do have a relationship, and you say it's rocky, but it's what is the basis of the problem? It's what seems to be they just don't click. What is the deal here? And this is important because on the last few days of her life, or at least before she disappears from the face of the earth, there are some messages for Richard Forster. So just before we get into that eventful day, let's talk a little bit about the relationship. What exactly do you say was the problem in the relationship? What did you think, or what were witnesses at that time, or what was Richard's viewpoint on what was the problem with the relationship?
Well, Richard Forster had also been married before, and he had a very expensive divorce. He had divorced his first wife, and she was dragging him through the coals for everything, and rightly so, because he refused to pay alimony, he refused to pay child support, so he was hit with a massive judgment, and here was Richard Forster, and he had been together with Robyn, and he had his baggage, and she had her baggage, and at some point after she had lost her job as a dental assistant, maybe it was the financial aspects of her trying to battle her ex-husband for alimony and Richard trying to come up with all this cash in order to fulfill this massive judgment that he had to pay. So money issues are never a good thing for a relationship. But it seemed like their relationship had maybe run its course. And even though they didn't live together, they had separate apartments. He claims she would spend 6 nights a week at his place, but she still maintained her own apartment. And her roommate at the time claimed that, not everything was really rosy. Because she was kind of, I think she liked Richard, but she always had her eye open for other opportunities. And when Gary Giordano showed up and offered her a trip to Aruba, here was a guy who had a history of larceny, a history of lying, a history of harassing his previous girlfriends, of being a bully, and of lying to women that he was a modeling agent, that he was a manager that booked modeling gigs. So here she is, probably not in the best time during her life, and this friend, who she obviously knows is interested in her, has propositioned her before, says, hey, I'll take you to Aruba. Come with me and let's get away from it all. And so she did, and she never came back.
Now, let's go backwards just a little bit and talk about Richard Forster. We've already set the stage that this relationship is not so good. So they are not together one day, and set the stage for that day that he gets I wasn't clear whether he got the phone call or he was listening to a message from a phone call that she made, and then talk about that day and the phone call or the message of the phone call that he listened to, and his deduction from there?
Well, they had been in a fight. Things hadn't been so good, and according to Robyn's roommate, she was about to break up with him. And he claims that he got a phone call from her a couple days after the last time he had seen her, and the phone call sounded strange. There was noise on the line, there was beeping on the line. It was an internationally placed phone call, and he didn't know that because she told him that she was in Orlando with her family. They took a last-minute trip to Orlando. And she was like, look, I can't talk, but we'll talk when I get back, and, I'll call you soon. And so he didn't even realize that she was out of the country. He tried to message her on Facebook, and she replied. They never had any other direct conversation after that, but they had, Facebook messages back and forth, and they were all kind of like, look, I care about you, Richard, and we'll talk when I get back. And so here was this boyfriend who didn't even realize that maybe he was being broken up with. I mean, he had been blindsided by this whole thing, apparently. Well, and so he's trying to get in touch with her desperately, and she's responding very cryptically on Facebook. And so it wasn't until the end, because he found out, because she admitted. Well, she was like, "Look, I went to Aruba. I'll be back soon. Don't worry about it. I'll be back at the end of the week." And he didn't even find out until the day after she was supposed to return that something had happened to her 3 days earlier, or 2 days earlier, as a matter of fact.
So he has limited contact with her. He gets this phone call, and again she says, "I can't talk, but we'll talk soon." Then she gets the email, "I love you, I care about you." Yeah, it does sound like kind of like, but we're going to have to break up kind of deal. But we'll discuss it when I get back. What is the last message that he does receive, and what day is that?
The last message was a Facebook message, and this was the day before that she had vanished. She vanished on a Wednesday. It was Tuesday, and he had been trying to call her, trying to message her, trying to email her, and it was obvious, I think, maybe to him that there were bigger problems in this relationship than he had first thought.
Right.
And so he was, he didn't like the idea of not being able to get in touch with her, so he kept trying to get in touch with her. And the last Facebook message was really like, I thinking about you, we'll talk soon. And after that, what was bizarre was he had seen her on Gmail, on his Gmail account. He had seen her indicator, come on. And, if you're familiar with Gmail chat, when someone who is one of your chat friends comes online and they want to be seen in chat, their little indicator goes green. Well, he says, I saw her indicator go green, and I tried to message her, and she didn't respond to me. And he found out later on, after he discovered that she had been missing, that her indicator had gone green after she had disappeared. So here again, he wasn't sure what was going on. He wasn't sure who was on her account or what was, how was she being manipulated.
Mm-hmm.
And the only person who knew what Robyn Gardner was up to was this guy she was with, Gary Giordano.
Now, what happens with who calls police and when do they call police? She's supposed to be back on Thursday. And, of course, there's no show. And then Friday, Andrew Coulson, which is Robyn's brother, called to say that Robyn's mother had said that Robyn was missing at sea. Tell us about this phone call and what was said and Forster's reaction.
Well, what happened was that Robyn's mother had gotten the phone call, from authorities. And, informing her that, your daughter is missing. And she went snorkeling with her travel companion, and she didn't come back to shore. She vanished. And so, of course, this is all news to the Colson family. And her brother,
she's not known for snorkeling or scuba diving or anything like this sort?
That was the thing that most of the people who knew her found to be suspicious, because Robyn Gardner was someone who liked to wear a lot of makeup and liked her hair done nice, and she wore hair extensions, and she wasn't known as the kind of adventurous girl to strap on a pair of fins and go snorkeling. She was the kind of girl who would have a few cocktails by the pool.
Yeah.
And so it seemed very suspicious to everyone. All of a sudden, Robyn went snorkeling? How did this happen? She doesn't snorkel. Yeah. And the only person, again, like the authorities were, right away, the authorities had started to look at this guy, Gary Giordano. They started to, they initiated a search, an island-wide search of Robyn. Coast Guard, boats, helicopters, and this all of a sudden, becomes a frantic search for a missing person, and her family is informed of this, almost 12 to 18 hours after the fact.
What does Giordano claim when he tells police, or what is Giordano's reaction? Because this is the thing that's amazing. What does Giordano do and say, and how? Give us the timeline here of what he does, and then what does he say happened, and who does he say that to?
Well, according to Gary Giordano, and according to eyewitness accounts, Gary and Robyn had been drinking at the hotel. They went and they stayed at the Marriott. They were in the same room together, and they were drinking, and then they went out for, lunch at a little bar. And so they were seen at the bar. There was actually pictures taken of them, the pictures where you can see them. And so there's evidence that they were there at this bar at about 2 o'clock or so, and that she was drinking and he was drinking, and she didn't really touch her food. And so then he claims that they, later on, just a few hours later, they were just hanging out, and he said, let's go snorkeling. They went in the water. They're kicking around off the shore, and all of a sudden, Gary claims that the current got stronger and started to pull him out. And he motioned to her. He said to her, he tapped her on the foot and motioned, look, let's go in. Hurry up. I think we might be in trouble here. Right. So he claims he started to swim for his life towards the shore, and by the time he got close enough, he turned around, and Robyn was gone. And so at approximately 5 o'clock late afternoon or early evening, he emerges from the water by himself, and he goes back to the bar because they were snorkeling very close to this bar. And he goes back to the bar and he knocks on the window on the door, and there's no answer. And he goes around to the kitchen and finally is able to have somebody call the police, and the police come, and all of a sudden they're like, well, what? How did this happen? How did you guys go snorkeling and she didn't come back? And why is there blood here on the beach? And why are you still wearing your toupee? And it's really, there was a lot of suspicion placed on Gary Giordano very, very quickly. But there was no evidence. There was no evidence to be found. There was no evidence that he had done anything wrong.
Well, the thing is, though, excuse me, they did find almost immediately a bloody palm, and you don't say whether that was ever identified, but there's a bloody palm print and an unused condom, and that's right behind the Rum Reef Bar and Grill. That's what happens early on, right? That they did
right,
find that?
And according to eyewitnesses who came forth later, Robyn had apparently cut her foot on the rocky beach. And a lot of people were suspicious of the fact that they had gone snorkeling off of this little beach behind this bar, because here was this, not very sandy, not very pleasurable beach. It was kind of rocky. She cut her foot. So she was seen having cut her foot. People saw her on the beach.
Right.
So, but they were never able to match whether or not that was her blood. They were never able to match whether or not it was that condom had any sort of DNA that would link them to either Gary or Robyn. And this was, and many people blame the fact that here is Aruba. This is a very, very small island community where the closest crime lab is another island away in Curacao. So this is a very sleepy town, and all of a sudden they have to perform CSI here. It's not going to happen.
Now, Robyn's mother actually travels to Aruba to try to find her missing daughter, doesn't she?
Right away, Robyn's mother goes, and she confronts this guy, Gary Giordano, and she described him as being very calm and not very concerned with the fact that here was somebody that he was with, who he introduced Robyn to the waiter at the restaurant as his wife, maybe half jokingly, but all of a sudden, here's somebody he was with, and he told Robyn, how much he cared about her and all that. But he just seemed very blasé about it. It was almost as if he had lost, a Frisbee or, a pair of sneakers. Mm-hmm. And so that again seemed very suspicious. And as Gary is stuck here on Aruba, watching this search go down, one of the things that was revealed later was the police. He was unable to be questioned by police immediately afterwards because he was intoxicated. So he excused himself as soon as the police arrived. He excused himself to go lay down because he couldn't answer their questions. And then when he could answer their questions, he didn't seem like he didn't seem too freaked out about the fact that his traveling companion had vanished.
The other thing that you put in the book is that is included is that it took 20 minutes. He has difficulty getting. It took 20 minutes for him to get someone to call police after emerging. Apparently, so not much of a panic if you think 20 minutes it takes for him to get a message to someone to call police after he emerges from that water.
No, and there is surveillance video from the bar that shows him immediately afterwards. And you see him in his bathing suit, actually wearing a pair of sneakers, and still wearing his really bad toupee, and he doesn't seem in a huge rush. And he's knocking on the door, and it does seem that I know personally, I feel that if I was in a situation where someone I cared about or someone I was traveling with or someone who I saw across the beach was in some kind of trouble, I don't know how much lingering I would do in order to try to find somebody to help me.
No evidence of the proper usual behavior after.
No, and this is all part and parcel of Gary Giordano's personality, because as it became revealed throughout the investigation, here was a guy who he was arrested for shoplifting from Target stores. He would go into Target stores around the D.C. area, and he would fill his car up with electronics, and he'd walk out. He'd just wheel the thing out, fill up his car. And this guy had the gall, he would go back and do it again. But because I guess they have some sort of, security compliance thing where they don't really confront people, they would never be able to call the police in time and get this guy arrested. Well, finally he was arrested, and he just didn't seem that concerned about the fact that he had stolen from the store, from these stores.
Well,
and he was a very bizarre individual someone who had a history of extremely bizarre behavior, very, very suspicious behavior in almost every aspect of his life.
Well, he's a brazen thief, and that would make sense to what he attempts to do here, and how out of touch he is with, reality here. He's certainly not insane, and he's not a stupid man, but he acts quite foolishly. So he's, we'll say, very, very overly confident. The most interesting aspect, and we alluded to it, so we might as well address this, is that police, of course, are going to look into motive for anybody being killed at any time by anyone. So what evidence do they find about the insurance policy, and where do they get some of this evidence from in terms of who do they speak to in terms of this insurance policy?
Well, not very long after Robyn disappears, Gary calls his insurance company. Now, he claims that he was instructed to do that by, he had retained a lawyer on the island of Aruba. Uh-huh. And he claims that the lawyer told him, you need to call your insurance company. So he called his insurance company. Well, it turns out that Gary Giordano, before they had left the United States, Gary had taken out a traveler's insurance policy on Robyn Gardner that covered accidental death. But it was a policy for $1.5 million, $1.5 million policy on someone he didn't really know. And he named himself the beneficiary and had her sign it. So here he was in contact with his insurance company, asking them all sorts of questions like, what do I do? What happens if they don't find her? What about any sort of bills that I get for the search? So he seemed much more concerned with this insurance policy than with Robyn's well-being. And as he tried to leave Aruba, he was detained at the airport, covered in sweat, just sweating profusely and acting very suspicious. And so they stopped him feet from getting on the plane.
Wow. And
they slapped the cuffs on him. And as he started to talk about what was going on, the insurance policy was revealed, and all of a sudden, not only does he have opportunity to kill Robyn Gardner, but he has motive to kill Robyn Gardner. And when you have opportunity and motive together, and someone as sketchy as Gary Giordano, well, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So the police feel like we have an open and shut case. We're going to lock this guy up, and we're finally going to prosecute somebody for, someone going missing. Well, it turns out it was much more difficult than that.
Yeah, certainly. So now what you do in Vanished Beauty is that you switch to the other story that you want to draw parallels to and draw the reader into for attention to the story about a woman named Tina Watson, Christina May Tina Thomas, born in 1977. Tell us a little bit about Tina Watson and her marriage in 2003, but tell us about Tina Watson. Who was she?
Tina Watson was another small-town girl from Alabama who was turning 30 and watching all of her friends get married. And so she married a guy who her family didn't feel was right for her. They felt that she was settling for this guy, Gabe Watson. And Gabe was kind of another odd duck. He wasn't really the most personable guy, wasn't really the most ambitious guy, not necessarily the kind of person that the in-laws really looked at and said, "Wow, we're thrilled to have you in our family." They were very, very cold to Gabe, and Gabe in turn just kind of alienated her family and insisted that, Tina, he told her, if you want to spend time with me, you have to do what I'm interested in, which is scuba diving. You have to be involved in my scuba diving hobby. Now, Gabe had gone off, and he had gotten himself certified as a scuba diver and certified as a rescue diver, as a matter of fact. Yeah. And so he gets Tina to also go to the same place, the same quarry in Alabama, to get her certification. And she was thrilled to be part of his life, that she could spend weekends with him and they could enjoy this together, which is why for their dream honeymoon, they were going to spend half of it sightseeing, which is what she wanted to do, in Australia, and the other half they were going to spend scuba diving on an excursion boat that would take them around the Great Barrier Reef. Well, as it turns out, I guess learning how to scuba dive in a quarry in Alabama really isn't good practice for scuba diving in the open waters in a red flag dive area like the Great Barrier Reef.
Now, the thing is, though, too, you do a great job of explaining this, and I'm ignorant about this. I've never scuba dived, so, I put my head underwater, and that's about it. So the thing is that we're talking about, he's been involved, he's a fanatic, David, since 96, and he's had 55. He's an experienced diver, and he's got his rescue diving certificate, and he's certified, but he's been doing it for a long time by the time we're talking 2003. She says, yes, I want to do this, but we're talking she's doing it just a couple months. She just gets certified a couple months, like you say, in this pool in a backyard or a pool somewhere, and it's only a couple months before this dream honeymoon. So I just wanted to say that as well, that compared to his experience, she is a real novice.
Oh, she's a complete noob. And as it turns out, Gabe didn't realize the situation they were entering. He didn't realize that maybe they weren't prepared for a dive like this, because even though he had been diving for quite a while and was certified as a rescue diver, he had never, the only open water dives he had done were to a much shallower depth in much calmer waters in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, the Great Barrier Reef that's definitely much more of an advanced scuba diving venue than, say, a quarry in Alabama or the calm waters around the Gulf of Mexico. And so they enter the water on their first dive after Tina had declined taking any sort of instructional dive from the dive master of their boat.
I think that's important because she declines twice. He's this master diver, and he's aboard this luxury boat, and part of this expedition is that he's taking responsibility, and despite she says no, I'm with my best buddy, my partner, my guy here, he says twice. So I think it's ironic that he singles her out and says, listen, I think you should I'm suggesting a training dive with a pro, and she declines twice.
Yeah, she's like, no, I'm here with my husband, my dive buddy here. And Tina seemed like she was kind of a submissive type. She really she wanted to make Gabe happy, was really what she wanted. And so there's no evidence that Gabe gave her a glance and said, oh, no, you're not getting a training dive. She just flat turned it down.
Right.
She thought that she was ready for something like this. And it turned out to be a very fatal mistake, because as they entered the water, there was a situation Gabe had with his equipment. They had to hang back a little bit. And as they fixed Gabe's dive computer so that it worked properly, so they could join the rest of the excursion group in the water, right away she had difficulty. And so within minutes of this dive, she was struggling, and she started to panic, and she started to sink. And Gabe turned around, and here she was trying to desperately right this situation. And she was overbreathing. She was panicked. She flailed her arm and knocked his mask away. And as he tried to right his regulator, his airpiece in his mouth, and put his mask back in place, while his wife is panicking, he finally looks down in the seconds that it took in order for him to be able to see and breathe again. He looked down, and she was sinking. She was sinking in this 90-foot water. She was 10 feet below him, and he turned and he tried to kick down to her and claims that he couldn't reach her, that she was sinking too fast. She was plummeting towards the bottom. And this was in minutes of them entering the water.
Right, 6 minutes, yeah.
So Gabe then makes a snap decision. Instead of trying to go down and get her, he went for help. And they were already at a depth at which he couldn't just shoot up to the surface. If he would have to ascend at a pace that would prevent him from getting air bubbles in his blood. The bends.
The bends.
Right. So you can die from the bends. And so he goes and he decides to get help while Tina sinks to the bottom. Now, where the story becomes interesting and how it intersects with the Robyn Gardner story, what I found very compelling was the fact that Gabe was accused of murdering his wife, and it turned out that there was the accusation came because there was an insurance policy. There was $1 million life insurance policy that Tina's father claims Gabe wanted switched so that he would be the beneficiary.
And this is shortly before their marriage.
This is shortly before their marriage.
And increased the amount to $1 million.
Right, maxed out the policy. She goes to her father and says, Gabe wants me to increase the life insurance policy to the full $1 million and make him the beneficiary. So Tina sinks to the bottom and she dies. And they rescue her body, but it's too late. And initially the whole thing is ruled as an accident. But it's not until her father gets a phone call from a couple of people who were on the boat who said, well, this Gabe, afterwards, he didn't really seem that concerned. He seemed he was playing cards, and I don't know, it doesn't all add up. And here was Gabe, this rescue diver, an experienced diver, and he couldn't rescue his wife.
You added two things, too, as well, that you added a history of Gabe Watson, despite having him claiming having hearing problems, had dove 75 feet to help his partner out, his diving partner. So there was at least that history of an attempt to dive down. She was down 90 to 100 feet, but he had dove in the past 75 feet to help his partner out, his buddy out. So the other thing was that you said that there was the Singleton, the master diver, was the actual person that got her off the bottom because he was already underwater for, you said, 7 minutes. And there was a doctor, Stutz, that claimed, maybe I'll let you explain to the audience what he said he witnessed underwater regarding Gabe and Tina.
Well, as the authorities were questioning the other people who were on the excursion, this doctor, and you go and you ask a doctor, what did you see? I mean, a doctor is a very credible witness.
Sure.
Just by virtue of the fact that he's a doctor. And the doctor says, well, I saw them struggling, and I saw Gabe hold her in a bear hug moments before she sank to the bottom. And the suspicion became that Gabe was holding Tina, turned off her air until she suffocated. And then once held her until she died. And then once she was dead, turned her air back on in order to make it seem like her gear was working. Not that somebody turned off her tank in mid-dive, because that would be suspicious. And so he claims that he saw them in a bear hug, that she was struggling, and then she sank to the bottom. And this is something that he claims he saw. And as the investigation went on, it really became this very questionable piece of evidence. Even though it was the most damning piece of evidence against Gabe, it was something that Dr. Stutz had only seen very fleetingly, and from 30 yards away, which is a considerable distance in the water, and from above. So here was somebody who saw something, but wasn't really sure what they saw. But again, it was enough evidence in order for the Australian authorities to eventually, years later, reopen the case at the behest of Tina's parents and charge Gabe with murder. But they weren't able to prove that he murdered her.
Right. Well, I mean, his case is you do jump back to the Gary Giordano case for our audience to see the reader to see the progress in that case. So let's go back to Gary Giordano and the mounting evidence against him, or the case against him, or the attempt. Now, what I was trying to allude to was that if people are listening kind of carefully, Gary Giordano seems to have much more of a motive, a very clear motive. Even though it's circumstantial evidence, there seems to be more of a case against him, it seemed, for your average Joe, as opposed to the Gabe Watson case. But just tell our audience before we get back to Giordano, which case did police and prosecutors think they had a solid case? Did they think Watson was comparable, we'll say, to the Giordano case in terms of enough circumstantial evidence to be able to prosecute the case?
Well, the Gabe Watson case happened years earlier. It happened in 2003. Mm-hmm. And it resurfaced again years later when the case had opened. So this happened before what had happened with Robyn Gardner. And it was one of the similarities in this case. It just felt like I was looking at what happened with Tina Watson and Gabe Watson. And I thought to myself, wait, is this what happened to Robyn? Is this the same situation? And as I looked at the evidence that was against Gary Giordano, there were elements of his case, of Gary's case, that were so open to interpretation. They didn't have any physical evidence against this guy. The only evidence that they actually found was that he and Robyn were involved in a sexual relationship, because he had a lot of, let's say, very dirty pictures of them doing the nasty in their hotel room on his camera. Mm-hmm. So this was not something he had disclosed before. And as these little pieces of information about Gary Giordano, that he had taken these pictures of them having sex, these dirty pictures of her posing on the bed and just them in the act, and it just made him seem slimier. And the fact that he had he contacted the insurance company, but this was the only evidence they had. They couldn't link him to any sort of physical evidence, and they didn't have a body. And without a body, it was even more impossible for them to try and pinpoint a cause of death or how he could have done anything to her. So he spent 4 months in jail while they tried to, they opened the case up, they tried to find more eyewitnesses, anyone who had come forth, and there were people who claimed that they saw Gary and Robyn talking to some strange tattooed man that afternoon before she vanished, and this man also vanished from the island. They couldn't find him, and of course there were accusations of this whole Natalee Holloway case became the suspect, Joran van der Sloot, became he became a sensation when he started to talk about, I sold Natalee Holloway into white slavery to a Venezuelan man. So all of a sudden people started to, did Gary Giordano sell Robyn Gardner into some, prostitution ring, some South American prostitution ring? Did she end up like Joran van der Sloot's story, where he claims that some man that he met at a casino offered him $10,000 for a blonde woman? Mm-hmm. And so all of these bizarre stories and twists from the Natalee Holloway case became points of interest in the Robyn Gardner case because of the similarity of the disappearances. So people were looking for this strange man who was a pimp for the South American, underground, and they were looking for ways that Gary Giordano could have been somehow interested in the Natalee Holloway disappearance, or was he somehow tied into organized crime? I mean, here's a guy with a vowel at the end of his name. He must be tied into some sort of mafia somewhere. And go ahead. No, go ahead.
The thing I wanted to ask was when do police get to speak to Sharon Cohen, who had 3 kids with him, and she said he can't control his anger. And then they found a very, very interesting person named Jeanette Farago, and so she talked about stalking, and then there's the offer. Then there's the offer with the mother and the daughter, and the modeling, which just shows his character, but also the very, very ironic and maybe we'll say cryptic. He says something referring to Natalee Holloway. So tell us a little bit about that. That's a fascinating aspect of this too. What he says and his past behavior, and when he's talking to the mother, trying to procure her daughter. Very interesting story.
So as this story opens up, and as the news are digging around for information about this guy, Gary Giordano, they find his first wife, and they find that there are, you can look up police records, so they're very easy to find, especially in the state of Maryland. So they look up his police records, and there he is, domestic abuse against his wife, and they look into the records, and the police showed up, and they had a fight, and she claimed he was abusive, and then there was this girlfriend that was shortly after his divorce, and she claims that he was stalking her, and he threatened her, and he was very controlling, and made her text him anytime she went somewhere to prove that she wasn't with somebody. Very jealous man. And so this thread of this jealousy and controlling behavior and somewhat psychotic personality was definitely something, this history of Gary Giordano wasn't painting a very nice picture of him. As a matter of fact, this Janet Farago, she claims that Gary once showed up outside of her window wearing a deer mask and holding a flashlight to his face just to freak her out or something, that he had taken pictures of her when they were having sex, and he had made copies of them, and after they broke up, he had put them in her neighbor's mailboxes to harass her. And she was so scared of the guy, she wouldn't go through with the restraining order.
Yeah, that's right. And
so as people are coming out of the woodwork, as the press, as people are locating these people who had any sort of legal conflict with Gary Giordano, and these women who claim that he was not a very nice person, well, all of a sudden this woman comes out and she says, well, not that long ago, Gary Giordano posed as a modeling talent manager, and he found my underage daughter's picture online on one of these modeling websites, amateur modeling websites. And he called us up, and he offered her a trip to Aruba for a modeling shoot, shoot that, of course, did not exist. And Gary said, well, I will be with her the whole time. I'll be her chaperone. And no need for you to come, Mom. I'll be taking care of it. We'll be staying in the same room. Don't worry, your underage daughter will be fine in Aruba on her modeling gig that doesn't really exist. And then when she started to question him, all of a sudden, in what would seem like a very unprofessional way, Gary started to proposition her as well. Well, I could probably do a mother-daughter shoot, and I've never been with a mother and daughter together. It got really kind of very, very greasy at that point.
What did he say about Natalee Holloway, though?
He said, because the mother was like, well, you're going to take my daughter out of the country. He said, don't worry, this isn't going to be another Natalee Holloway thing. He's invoking the memory of Natalee Holloway to try and reassure this mother that he's going to take care of her daughter on this trip to Aruba that he wants to take her to, an underage girl. And so it was, she wasn't underage really. She was really kind of age, but young. And so when this comes out in the wake of his arrest, all of a sudden, there is even more suspicion heaped on Gary Giordano. Here's someone who has a history of lying to women to get them to try to go to Aruba with him so that he can have sex with them. He's a sexual predator.
He had also purchased, which is even more interesting, he had also purchased an insurance policy a month before, or 6 months before, for Carrie Emerson.
Yes, and so here was this. All of a sudden, there was a theories brewing that this was his plan. He's going to take a woman to Aruba, make her vanish without any eyewitnesses, and then claim this big insurance prize. And it became even more suspicious when it was revealed later on that not long before this, Gary tried to sue a company. Gary Giordano owns this very small tech HR firm that he runs out of his house. This $1 million mansion he has in outside of D.C. And so he had tried to sue one of his clients for $5 million. Well, it turns out that Gary, the case ended up being dropped Gary ended up dropping the case because he had forged documents. He had committed fraud. So in order to cleanly walk away and not be arrested for fraud or anything like that, he walked away from this case. But here was a guy who's willing to commit fraud in court to try to sue for $5 million against a company that he claims did him wrong, which didn't. So, this again, all of these things come out. Here's a guy willing to scam millions of dollars from this company. Of course, this all fits into his profile.
Now, we've only got, we're going to go a little bit later because we have two detailed stories here, but I know you don't want to give too much information here in terms of some of the surprises here in terms of, is there a conviction? What's the success at trial? What's the defense? How do they try to defend against this? So we won't have time to go into all that. But let's first go into Gary Giordano. Now that the police have all this information, can they lay charges? And how does that work in Aruba? How does that work?
Well, the justice system in Aruba is different from the justice system we have here in America. Aruba is a Dutch protectorate, so the Dutch laws are far different in terms of the rights that you have when you are arrested. For instance, like when you are arrested in Aruba, like he was not able to have counsel when he was being questioned. Right. And they were able to hold him for extended periods of time, and they would get extensions on this detainment. So originally he was only going to be detained for 60 days, and then they extended another 30 days and another 30 days while they tried to build a case against him. And during this time, without any physical evidence that they could find, all they had was opportunity and motive, and with no body. Same thing with Natalee Holloway. With no body, they weren't able to. It's not that they didn't want to. The Solicitor General, their Attorney General type figure. It's not that they didn't want to bring charges against him. They were unable to file charges against him because the country, the judicial system demanded that he be let go because there was no evidence against him that they could prove that he had done anything wrong. Yeah. But what really happened there, it goes so much further than just that, than just the lack of evidence. Because what really happened there is really what I feel I discovered what truly happened to Robyn Gardner. And it's even more shocking than what you may think was done to Robyn Gardner.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's just leave it at that. We'll leave the audience wanting more. On the other side of the coin here with Gabe Watson, in terms of evidence against him, again, how did police proceed, and what was the success in terms of being able to file charges against him?
Well, when Gabe Watson, when they filed charges against Gabe Watson for the murder of his wife, of Tina Watson, he volunteered to come back to Australia to face the music. And he went of his own volition, not knowing if he would ever come home, because if he was convicted of murder, he could spend the rest of his life behind bars in a foreign country. But as
now,
it turned out...
would a defense lawyer advise, like, because, you know, it's like the Amanda Knox, they refile charges, but any defense lawyer worth a nickel is going to say, don't bother, don't go. Could he have gotten defense advice like that, if, you know, or did it really represent that he was doing the honorable, honest, you know, something that an innocent person might do?
Well, what had happened was the case got reopened because Tina Watson's family went to their congressman, went to, they were trying to get anyone who would listen, especially in government, to compel the Australians to open this case.
Right.
So there was enough. There was definitely a very strong feeling that if Gabe Watson said, you're going to have to drag me back kicking and screaming, that they would have done so. Okay. And he felt that there was enough evidence to prove that he didn't murder her, that he was willing to go back. And the fact that he was willing to go back was a very, very big factor in what had happened. Because in the end, they couldn't charge him with murder. The best that they could do was accept a plea bargain for manslaughter, and a specific type of manslaughter in Australia that deemed Gabe Watson was he was negligent.
Negligent homicide?
Well, no, that he was a bad dive buddy.
Okay.
Really is what it comes down to. And so they expected, the family still expected that they were going to throw the book at him. And I think Gabe accepted his fate, that he bore some responsibility as to what happened, because ultimately he mistook his certification for experience. And when it came down to it, he was a bad dive buddy, and he was not the right person to be there. And he had the responsibility, especially in under Australian law, when you undertake some sort of extreme sports or anything like that with someone, you have a responsibility for their well-being. And since she didn't come back, he was convicted of being a bad dive buddy, and he went to jail. And what I found very interesting about this case was not so much really what happens to Gabe Watson, because I feel like I can talk about what happens to Gabe Watson and reveal what happens to him, but it's how it actually informs what had happened and the investigation and really the nuances and the circumstances behind the Robyn Gardner case. Because at first I thought that this was what happened to Robyn Gardner, but it turns out that that's just the very tip of the iceberg, the very edge of the story.
Wow. And with Gabe Watson, what is your conclusion from that?
That Tina Watson died because she married an idiot. Because here she was emotionally, physically, and mentally unprepared for this dive that she undertook. She took an advanced dive with little or no skills with someone who was not able to identify the dangerous situation that they were about to enter.
Right.
And really, the title of the book, Vanished Beauty, is not just a reference to here are two beautiful women who vanished, but it has more to do with society's viewpoint of what happens. It's really, the book is not just about these cases, but it's about how we react and how we perceive these cases and how we treat the whole concept of the accused. And so it's and then there's another aspect to the title which speaks towards what really happened to these women. But that I'll leave for the readers.
Oh, great. Yeah, it's a very, very interesting, and I was interested to hear your conclusion on Gabe Watson too, because again, throughout the story, you don't know if it's a lot more nefarious than that, and in terms of his motive. Again, he has the insurance policy. You do allude to that he did do this rescue before of 75 feet. And then you just leave the reader to decide, is this guy guilty or not? And so you leave it up in the air, and I applaud you for that. And I think the audience has been titillated here in terms of what exactly Robyn Gardner, what was she up to, and more about Gary Giordano, because obviously we couldn't cover everything of this guy's wacky character. So something for the audience to look forward to in reading Vanished Beauty. So I want to thank you for a very engaging interview and keeping the mystery alive to this book, for sure, certainly.
Dan, it was my absolute pleasure.
Well, I want to thank you very much, and I hope to have you back on again talking about another one of your fine books. And again, thank you very much for this interview, and good night.